Ever notice how, like, after a crazy day, your shoulders up to your ears and you just want to hide under a blanket?
Oh, tell me about it.
Totally. We've all been there, right?
Yeah.
But here's a thought. What if all that stress, that feeling of being totally overwhelmed, is messing with us in ways we don't even realize?
Okay, now you've got my attention.
Yeah, so today we're really diving deep into the work of Dr. Gabor Maté. He's this doctor who's made this really strong connection between stress, trauma, and get this, our physical health.
Wow.
Right. Wild. We found this article laying out his main ideas, and let me tell you, it's pretty intense stuff.
Yes.
We're talking how everything from when we were kids to, like, keeping our feelings bottled up can actually show up as physical problems later on.
It's all connected.
Totally. So ready to unpack all this?
Absolutely, let's do it.
Okay, cool. So he talks about this thing called wholeness. Have you heard of this?
Yeah, it's actually a really key part of his work. It's like this state of being where we're just completely in sync with our emotions and what we need, like something we're born with.
So it's like we're hardwired for it from the get-go.
Exactly. Think of a baby. They cry when they're hungry. They giggle when they're happy. It's all just like pure feeling, no filter.
We're just being real, you know?
Totally. And then we grow up and we learn to, well, not always be so real. We learn to be polite, put on a brave face, even when it means pushing down what we're actually feeling.
Right, like be seen and not heard.
Yeah, and while those social rules, they have their place, Dr. Maté says that constantly holding back our emotions, especially as kids, can really stick with us.
And that's where this mind-body connection comes in, right? We always think of stress as like headaches or feeling tired, but it sounds like he's saying it goes way deeper. Way deeper. He believed that being stressed out all the time, often because we're not processing or expressing our emotions or even setting good boundaries for ourselves, that can actually affect us on a cellular level.
Whoa, seriously. Seriously. He talks about how constant stress weakens our immune systems, causes inflammation, and might even make us more vulnerable to all sorts of diseases like arthritis, heart disease, even some cancers.
Okay, now I'm stressed just hearing about all this. But really, it makes you think twice about all those times we just swallow our feelings, you know, to avoid a fight or make someone happy.
It's true. It makes you wonder, are we doing ourselves more harm than good?
Right. So how does, like, how we were raised play into all of this?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. He compares how we parent today with how it's done in indigenous cultures.
Okay, I'm listening. What's different?
So, in a lot of indigenous cultures, babies are held and carried almost all the time, comforted the second they seem upset.
So it's like constant physical contact.
Exactly. And that creates this deep feeling of security, this really strong emotional bond.
Interesting. So it's less about teaching them to be independent and more about, like, really nurturing that need for connection right off the bat. So are you saying, like, if we don't grow up like that, with all that closeness, are we kind of doomed to be stressed out?
Well, it's not quite that black and white, but it's definitely something to think about.
Right.
Remember we were talking about wholeness, like being totally connected to ourselves?
Yeah.
So when kids don't get that consistent emotional support, they start figuring out how to deal with it on their own, you know, kind of disconnecting from their true selves.
Makes sense.
And while that might work when they're little, it can come back to bite them as adults.
So it's like we learn to cope, but those coping mechanisms, they stick around even when they're not helping us anymore.
Exactly. And those ways of coping, they often come from our childhood, and they show up in how we handle stress, set boundaries, even just talking about what we need in our relationships.
Wow. So how do we even start to, like, untangle all that?
Well, this is where Dr. Maté gets really practical. He's got this concept called compassionate inquiry.
Compassionate inquiry. Okay, what's that?
It's basically self-reflection, but like on a deeper level. You ask yourself these really tough questions, but in a kind way, trying to figure out why you do the things you do, why you believe the things you believe.
So not just what you're feeling, but the why behind it.
Yes. Like, let's say you can never say no at work, even when you're totally swamped. Compassionate inquiry would be asking yourself, why is it so hard for me to set boundaries? What am I afraid of? When did I learn that saying no is bad?
So you're trying to trace those patterns back to the beginning, see where they came from, and if they're still relevant.
Exactly. And usually when you really look at those beliefs you've been holding on to, you realize they might have made sense once, maybe when you were a kid, but not so much anymore.
Like we're following an old, outdated script.
And that's the amazing thing about compassionate inquiry. It gives you the power to rewrite that script, to find new ways of being, new ways of treating yourself and interacting with the world.
So it's like everything's connected. What happens early on, especially in our families, it shapes how we see the world, how we act, how stressed we get, even our physical health.
Right, but it's not about blaming anyone.
Yeah, just understanding.
Exactly. It's about understanding and realizing that we can change things. And Dr. Maté doesn't just point out the problems, he offers solutions too. Along with compassionate inquiry, he talks a lot about building something called intrinsic self-esteem.
Okay, intrinsic self-esteem. Now that's a new one. So intrinsic self-esteem, what's that all about? How's it different from, just regular self-esteem?
Well, think of it like this. Imagine self-esteem is like a house, right?
Okay, a house. Got it.
So contingent self-esteem, the kind we usually develop early on, it's like building that house on rented land.
Rented land.
Yeah, it's shaky. It all depends on outside stuff achievements, how we look, what other people think.
Ah, so your worth is always riding on whether you're succeeding or failing at those things.
Exactly, which is like the perfect recipe for stress because those external things are always changing. You get that promotion, feels great, right? But then it's on to the next thing. You're never really secure.
Exhausting. Always chasing the next thing to prove yourself. So how do we get off that treadmill? Is that where intrinsic self-esteem comes in?
You got it. Intrinsic self-esteem is like building that house on solid ground. It comes from inside. It's knowing you're worthy just because you are. Achievements or other people's opinions be damned.
That sounds amazing, honestly.
Yeah,
To just feel worthy because you exist, period.
right. It changes everything. And Dr. Maté says developing this intrinsic self-esteem, that's key to stressing less and having a more fulfilling life. When your worth isn't based on all those external things, you don't get so caught up in that cycle of stress and self-doubt.
So how do we build this superpower then? This intrinsic self-esteem? What's the secret?
$1 million question. And while there's no magic bullet, Dr. Maté talks about awareness being a huge first step. Just realizing how our past experiences, they're still shaping us, that's big.
Like shining a light on those old patterns, bringing them out into the open so we can actually choose to do things differently.
Exactly. And once we see it, then we can start doing that compassionate inquiry we were talking about, challenging those old beliefs and learning to be kinder to ourselves, flaws and all.
This has been amazing. We've gone so deep on how our emotions and physical health are connected, how stress and trauma, they affect us on like a fundamental level. But the good news is there are ways to heal, to grow. Things like compassionate inquiry, more mindful parenting, and building that inner strength of intrinsic self-esteem.
Absolutely. We might not be able to change the past, but we have the power to choose how we react to it now. By understanding these patterns and connecting with ourselves on a deeper level, we can create a healthier, happier future for ourselves.
Love that. So here's something to think about today. What if you started treating yourself with the same compassion you'd give a friend who is struggling? What if, instead of judging those tough emotions, you got curious about them? Until next time, keep asking those questions, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.